Could Giorgio Scalvini be set to become Newcastle United's main defensive transfer target? In this video, we're going to be looking at him and the latest with Marc Guehi and Ousmane Diomande, and also crazy rumours linking Newcastle with a move for striker Randal Kolo Muani. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Welcome back to another episode of NUFC Transfer Daily. Thanks so much to everybody who's continued to support, like and share the videos. I really do appreciate all the support. If you haven't already though, hit like and subscribe and join the community. In today's video, we're going to be looking at intensifying rumours linking Newcastle with Giorgio Scalvini. Also, I have some thoughts on a rumour linking Newcastle with a move for a top European striker that we'll get into as well. So basically, we spoke yesterday and I analysed with stats and discussed why I think Giorgio Scalvini would be an incredible signing despite his injury record. And it's since emerged that Newcastle do like him. He's on their list and is being viewed in some quarters as a dream target. That's what Fabrizio Romano seemed to suggest on Instagram yesterday. So we're going to be discussing whether Newcastle will reevaluate their centre-back situation, because there are moving parts with the three players who've mostly been named as those main targets, and it's obviously been Marc Guehi for quite some time. Newcastle aren't giving up on him. We'll discuss him, as well as Ousmane Diomande, who's linked to Marc Guehi because the train of events is basically if Guehi leaves, Crystal Palace want Diomande to replace him, and obviously you're throwing in Giorgio Scalvini into that mix as a different option. And we discussed yesterday his injury record, the fact he played 6 games last season for Atalanta, but rightly so. I think it's a very fair point that Newcastle do like to hit these deals when these top players are in a bit of a dip in form and maybe they're more accessible, more easier to get. And you saw that with Alexander Isak at the back end of his Real Sociedad career. He'd been linked heavily with big clubs like Liverpool and Arsenal, who obviously now would do anything to sign him, but at the time they took a look and ignored him and moved elsewhere for other players, and Newcastle had a free run at him because lots of people looked at him after a difficult season, scoring I think 6 goals in La Liga, that he wasn't living up to the hype and he was too much of a risk at 70 million euros. Newcastle paid that money and have been justified heavily in that. And it's a very similar sort of situation, although it's slightly differently because of the injury situation. And I did mention that there are concerns that 3 of the back 4 in that instance would have serious knee injuries to their name, and that, cruciate knee ligament injuries are quite dangerous in terms of a recurrence rate. They often happen again. Your knees are quite weak after a cruciate injury, so that is a concern. But another example, and probably a more pertinent example as well, of a player who has come into Newcastle off the back of a similar situation is Tino Livramento, and he's never really looked back. He's now obviously heavily linked with Manchester City, and we're not going to be discussing that on today's episode because that doesn't seem to be going anywhere. The message that sort of emerged over the last sort of 24 hours since the last video was that Scalvini has been well liked for quite some time and is viewed as a very high target for Newcastle if a deal's possible. And unlike Guehi, who's sort of a known quantity and very highly rated, but known quantity in the Premier League, Scalvini has got an incredibly high ceiling. As I mentioned yesterday, comparisons with Paolo Maldini, and he's just been robbed of that ability to develop over the last year because of his injury record. He does a cruciate knee ligament injury and a shoulder injury, which have no link to each other. Do they make them injury prone? This is a discussion I've had about Alexander Isak. He's been called injury prone at Newcastle. Is that really fair, considering the fact that he had a serious hamstring injury in this first season that kept him out for a full 5 months? Then he came back, and since he's had a groin problem that he's never really been able to shake, but at the same time the club hasn't been able to give him that opportunity to fully recover from it, so it's always kept coming back. Is that injury prone? That's a big debate to have, and there's a very similar sort of situation with Scalvini. So we discussed him yesterday in terms of details, in terms of how he fit into the team, his statistics, in terms of how he plays. I'm not going to go back into all that, but it does sort of seem that Scalvini might be moving ahead of other options in the defensive situation. Let's see how that plays out. Guehi, the situation is that Liverpool are interested, and the thought process last week when it emerged, and I was definitely very down about this. If Newcastle were going to be going for Guehi, surely they should have got further ahead earlier in the window, because Liverpool coming to the table now, they're discussing whether to move for him now or go for him on a free transfer at the end of the season. That's where the doors may be slightly opened again, because Guehi wants to move this summer by all accounts. Also may not play every week because Konate is there with Van Dijk as a sort of main partnership at Newcastle. He would walk straight into that team, I'm pretty sure of that. Ousmane Diomande is the other player to discuss. Crystal Palace have him in mind as a potential replacement for Guehi, and those talks, apparently according to reports in Portugal, are not progressing well, with €50 million valuation on his head. Apparently his release clause is €80 million, which is news to me because I believed it was 50 million. So if that is wrong, I'll hold my hands up on that. But if that is how high Sporting Lisbon's valuation is, then we'll see whether Newcastle enter the fray, especially if they can get a deal for Scalvini on the table as well. So I think those three players, it'll be very interesting to see where Newcastle move and what they do. But perhaps the door isn't quite as shut on Guehi as I thought, and maybe a deal for Scalvini, though, might be first in line, because he does really fit the bill of a Newcastle player, and one of those sort of signings that I know it's now emerged, so maybe this doesn't count, but what people were asking me in the Q&A was, are Newcastle going to be making Tonali-esque signings? And Scalvini is incredibly similar to Tonali in terms of how he's viewed in Italy, how he's been viewed as a young player, and how he maybe is more gettable than people assume when that link first emerges. I was very, very sceptical of the initial links with Tonali, and then that ended up happening very quickly. It's very far off that at the moment. Newcastle are only known to like Scalvini. There is no evidence of a potential move here yet, but it would be very interesting to see if they do. And I'm a little bit more confident, hearing the noises over the last 24 hours, that this could move forward if Newcastle so choose. But they're basically, I would imagine that they're sat here with a sort of crossroads, thinking in one direction you've got Scalvini, in another one you've got Diomande, and hearing the noises from Portugal and the fact that his valuation is a little bit higher than potentially Newcastle and Crystal Palace had initially banked on. And then you've got Marc Guehi, who, if you can sell that dream of playing first team football, and again the noises that are emerging are that Newcastle are definitely not off the table in terms of an option for Guehi, and it might be worth doing. But as I said in my video last week, I'm mystified as to how Newcastle have not moved. If they're interested in Guehi, how they've not made more progress on a move and allowed Liverpool to come to the table. I think it would be difficult to beat Liverpool to that signing, because they're the Premier League champions, because there's a route into the team, because there's doubt over Konate's future and the wages that they can offer, and there's lots of things that Liverpool can offer that Newcastle can't. Although Newcastle aren't off the table, they seem to have conceded a little bit in the race, and I think that is potentially why I think that they're moving in a slightly different direction. So we'll see how this plays out, but three centre-backs are being named all the time, and of course it could become someone completely different. We've spoken about Jan-Paul van Hekken before. Nathan Collins we know is of interest as well from Brentford, as I mentioned last week. So the centre-back situation is getting a little bit more interesting, and again, people have spoken about the turn into July, and that's when Newcastle are going to really ramp up. And I said in my Q&A, it's not really that Newcastle haven't really acted slowly by comparison to other windows. They're acting as you would expect them to act in June. That's when you inquire. That's when you put feelers out. You really only bid mainly. I know this isn't always the case, but clubs usually bid for players and make deals happen in July. When you haven't signed a player for 3 years and your board is about to leave, there's lots of reasons why Newcastle fans are getting a little bit twitchy. But as I said, we're seeing now why things are going to move up and quickly. Just to add to that, the talks are ongoing with James Trafford as well. That looks like it could happen. And Fabrizio Romano, again, mentioned very interestingly that that's a deal that is going to get going in July. So Newcastle are pushing more for a July situation. But it's PSR week now. I did speak yesterday about Aston Villa and Jacob Ramsey. I wonder if that could happen. It does appear more as if July is when Newcastle will begin to ramp their actions up in terms of incomings. Another quick thing I want to say about these rumours with Randal Kolo Muani. I know you all know these things anyway because we've spoken about them intently, but also I think many people use common sense. Newcastle's name is often used in Europe as a pawn in these sort of deals, agents, especially with players who are available. Randal Kolo Muani is an excellent striker, 26-year-old Frenchman, very, very similar to Isak in the way he plays as well, very good on the ball dribbler, good finisher, powerful player, but He's not wanted by PSG. Luis Enrique wants to get rid of him. He was on loan at Juve from January onwards, scored 8 goals in 16 Serie A games, which is a really, really good record. He's an excellent striker, but his wages are nearly 100 grand a week. The value on his head would be huge. A loan deal, would that really suit Newcastle for what they want? And he wouldn't play every week. And this is just an example of what you need to be wary of when it comes to Newcastle and transfer rumours, because that really doesn't make any sense. And Eddie Howe said this, he's not going to look for established names because Newcastle can't pay the wages, they can't really compete for those players. That's why they want to create their own superstars, and maybe they can go and buy a Tonali here and there, but Kolo Muani isn't going to come in as that type of player. He's going to come in as an option to play alongside or instead of Isak, and this is why they're moving for João Pedro, because he can play out wide. Kolo Muani can as well, but again, it just doesn't make sense, this one, and it's far too easy to use Newcastle's name, especially when you're a European publication, because there isn't the scrutiny on the finances of Newcastle. It's very easy to sell Newcastle as Saudi-owned, the richest owners in the world, and they have all this money to splash. And actually, the reality, as we know, is that just isn't the case. So the Kolo Muani thing, I'm sure Newcastle are big fans of his. As I say, they like a lot of players. He's a very, very good player. But can you really see this one happening? I didn't comment on rumours linking Newcastle with Jadon Sancho and Marcus Rashford, very much for the same reason. It just helps gain interest. The agent will be putting it out. That's how these things work. So the Kolo Muani rumours, he's an excellent striker, and I can understand why people are quite excited about it, but absolutely not one for me. The situation around it's far too simplistic. It's far too easy for an agent to put Newcastle's name out there, when the reality is that Newcastle don't have the finances to do that deal for a player who isn't going to play every week on the wages that he's on, the demands he'll have. He's been linked with Manchester United as well. That one is probably more likely because they do need a number 9 and a main striker to replace Rasmus Højlund. But I think you can count Newcastle's name out of this one. We'll, of course, revisit it if it gains pace, but I really, really doubt that it will. And just finally, Sean Longstaff has been linked with Everton again this morning. Newcastle are open to selling him. Obviously, he's got a year left in his contract. He would be pure profit in a PSR sense as well if they could sell him. He's very much down the pecking order in terms of midfielders, and I'm actually going to write a piece on Louis Miley for Forbes this afternoon, so that'll be out later. But Longstaff's future looks bleak, but the one thing I would say is that, again, I will repeat it, it's a very serious thing to suggest about the squad makeup for the Champions League, because Newcastle don't have enough players who go into that category of club trained over the age of 21. Longstaff is one of those players who could do something in the first team, which is even rarer, because now they don't have the likes of Paul Dummett, and they don't have, Marc Gillespie doesn't count. There's talks of bringing Tim Krul and Fraser Forster back just to sort of satisfy those rules. So in that sense, does it make sense to sell Longstaff when he has played first team football and done very well for Newcastle? Obviously scored in that PSG game, played in the Champions League last time. I know a lot of fans don't particularly rate him, especially in comparison to other players, and I know that the midfield is already bloated and there's talk of Newcastle going in for another player. Whether he has a first team slot in his future is very, very doubtful, but at the same time, that Champions League thing is a real consideration. So, as I say, let me know in the comment section what you think about anything we discussed, whether that's Scalvini, Diomande or Guehi, or Kolo Muani, or Sean Longstaff. Thanks so much for joining me on this episode, and I'll see you tomorrow for the next one.